Shalom, this is Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat, PNN Radio. Shalom, זה הרב המשיחי זאב פורת, רדיו PNN.
Well, joining us to talk about the possibility that a third temple must rise on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem is best-selling author Carl Gallups. Carl is like I said, the best-selling author of Final Warning, Magic Man in the Sky, The Rabbi Who Found Messiah, and more to come. He is a longtime pastor of Hickory Hammock Baptist Church. He is a Bible scholar, and he is a valuable contributor to PNN News and Ministry Network. In fact, he is our go-to guy for stuff like this. Carl Gallups, happy to have you with us once again here.
Mike, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the gracious introduction.
Hey, listen, Carl, there is a lot of excitement, as you know. People are talking about the possibility of a third temple in Jerusalem. Some people are saying that this red heifer that they're finding, perhaps even multiple red heifers, people are very excited about that. Some people are even saying that the third temple is actually built in a super secret warehouse somewhere in Israel, ready to be assembled on the Temple Mount. You wrote an article for the PNN News and Ministry Network recently. You're not so convinced that a third temple needs to be built there, are you?
Well, no, I'm not. But let me just say, Mike, and thank you for asking me this and letting me speak to this. First of all, I'm not dogmatic about this subject either way. But what I want to do is just take an honest look at two biblically allowed possibilities. One is a literal rebuilt temple in the last days before the return of Christ, which would be occupied by the Antichrist, and that's a very popular interpretation of Scripture. The problem is that interpretation comes straight from the English translations, but not from the original languages. What we're going to do today is a study of the original languages and what is actually said in the Scriptures, and it is astounding. It leaves a huge possibility, I mean a monumental possibility, that we're speaking of a metaphorical temple or a symbolic temple of something better than or greater than an actual rebuilt literal building in Jerusalem. So I'm anxious to do this study with you and the listeners because I want people to know the truth. And again, I'm not dogmatic. I'm not saying that I've got it 1,000% right, and people who believe in a literal rebuilt temple are 1,000% wrong. But what I'm saying is, and I will prove, I'm getting ready to make an astounding statement, but I will prove it from the original languages. What I'm saying is, there are no scriptures in the Bible, when you use the original languages, that demand or insist on a literal rebuilt third temple in Jerusalem for the Antichrist to occupy. Now, I know that's astounding for people who have read the English text and who have read all the books about it and all the different commentaries or opinions about this third temple. But by the time we finish this word study, the listeners are going to see very clearly that is just not in the Bible in any literal fashion at all. And let me just say this before we start the word study. All the hoopla about a red heifer. Do you know there is not a single prophecy in the Scriptures about a red heifer sacrifice in the last days? Not a single one. There's not a single mention of a red heifer sacrifice at the rebuilding of the second temple. Now, that is in the Scriptures, the rebuilding of the second temple.
Right.
And then that temple was later added onto by King Herod, and we read about that in the New Testament. And in the New Testament, there's not a single mention of a red heifer sacrifice. As a matter of fact, we find out that, the temple that's spoken of throughout the New Testament, other than the literal temple, of course, when we see Jesus and the disciples in front of the literal temple, but the temple that Paul speaks of and Peter speaks of and the other New Testament writers, the temple is the church of Jesus Christ, the New Testament church, the individual believers that are the building blocks of the temple of God. Know you not that your body is a temple of God. Know you not that God is building his temple with we as the building blocks. And so Okay, so with all of this in mind, Mike, let me do this word study with you in the audience concerning the word temple, and particularly as it is connected to the Antichrist, or as Daniel calls him, the abomination that causes desolation. So let's do this word study, because this is fascinating. Because what a lot of people have been taught, and what a lot of people think the Scriptures say, the Scriptures don't really say that. And so this is going to be an amazing study. This is going to be an eye-opening study for a lot of our listeners today. All right, so let's jump into this word study. All right, first of all, when we speak of, let's talk about the New Testament first. There are two Greek words that are used prolifically throughout the New Testament for the word temple. The first Greek word is Strong's word number 2411. I'm going to give these numbers so that the listeners can look this up and check behind me. It's 2411, and it's pronounced in English, I guess, the transliteration, Hieron, and it's spelled H-I-E-R-O-N. Hieron is how you would pronounce it in English. Now, that's Strong's 2411. Now, the definition right out of the lexicon is, it is used to denote an actual physical temple, the building itself. And by the way, every time that word Hieron is used in the New Testament, it's always speaking of the literal temple that was in Jerusalem at the time that the writers were talking about the temple, Hieron. Now that's important, because if we're going to talk about the rebuilding of a literal temple, you certainly would think the word Hieron would be used. And so it can mean the temple, the whole building, or specifically the outer courts that are open to the worshipers. Now, that's going to be hugely important when we get to the passage in Revelation 11, where John's told to go measure the temple and specifically the outer courts.
Yes.
We're going to see what word is used there. Okay, so Hieron is one of the Greek words used in the New Testament for temple, and the other Greek word used is naos, or I suppose it would be pronounced more appropriately naos.
Naos.
Okay, so N-A-O-S. So Hieron and naos.
Hieron and naos.
Is Strong's 3485. Strong's number 3485. All right, you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
No, I was just trying to get the iteration right. Hieron and naos. Okay, I just want to make sure I get that right. Okay, because
yes, Hieron and naos. Now, the definition in Strong's lexicon of naos is, there are three possibilities. Number one, it can be used for a literal temple, of course, but remember, every time the literal temple in Jerusalem is spoken of, the word Hieron is used. We'll get more to that in a moment. But naos can be used for a literal temple. Another use of it is to speak of any temple, a heathen temple or a shrine. So when it talks about a Babylonian temple or a Greek temple, the word naos is used. Now watch this. The third Greek lexicon use of naos is, and it literally says it in the lexicon, or to speak metaphorically, as in the spiritual temple representing all Christians joined by Christ. In other words, the church. Now that's powerful.
That's amazing. Yes.
That's interesting, because now we're going to find out where these two words, Hieron and naos, are used in the New Testament. So let's go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, where it says, he, and it's speaking of the Antichrist, will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Now, Mike, it's important for the listeners to know this is the only verse in the entire New Testament that directly connects the Antichrist with a, quote, temple. I'm putting quotes around the word temple because we're going to find out what that word is. The only passage in the entire New Testament that connects the Antichrist with the temple. So people focus in on that and say, see, there has to be a rebuilt third temple. Because 2 Thessalonians says he'll set himself up in the temple. However, this passage uses the Greek word naos instead of Hieron.
Right.
which gives it the distinct possibility of naos's main use in the New Testament, and that is metaphorically.
Right.
And, of course, then it would possibly represent the church or some apostate version of the church in the last days.
Right.
And by the way, by the time we get to the book of Revelation, we'll talk about this a little more in a moment, every mention of the word temple in the book of Revelation uses the word naos. It never uses hieron. That's
Right.
extremely important. Because you see, John, whenever John talks of a literal temple building in the Gospel of John, for example, let's talk about the Gospel of John for a moment.
All right.
There are like 12 or 14 times where the word temple is used in the Gospel of John, okay?
Right.
Now, this is important because, remember, John wrote Revelation as well. Every single time John speaks of a literal temple building in the Gospel of John, he uses the word hieron. But twice, and only twice, the word temple is used symbolically in the Gospel of John, and John purposely uses the word naos
Right.
instead of hieron. And I'll give you those two verses. In John 2:19 and in John 2:21, just a couple of verses each. It says, John 2:19, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and of course he was pointing to himself,
Right.
and I will raise it again in 3 days.
Right.
And in John 2:21, John says, but the temple Jesus had spoken of was his own body.
Right.
And so in using the word temple there, he uses the word naos and not hieron.
Right.
Now, Mike, that's monumentally important
Yes.
because when John writes Revelation, remember he wrote the book of John, so every time in the book of Revelation the word temple is used, John never uses the word hieron, which is always used to describe the literal temple in Jerusalem. But every time in the book of Revelation he uses the word temple, or what we would translate as temple, he uses the word naos. Now that is huge. Now, also it's important to know that every single time the word temple is used in Revelation, except for the possibility of Revelation 11:1, which is very important, we're going to get to it, every single time the word temple is used, it is speaking of the temple of God in heaven, which of course we know is the most literal, the most real temple. It is the reality. Everything on earth is a shadow of the reality, the Bible tells us. So, but every time John uses the word temple in Revelation, it is always about the temple in heaven, except for Revelation 11, and he always uses the word naos, even in Revelation 11. Now, here's Revelation 11:1. Quote, I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshipers there.
Yes.
Now, why didn't John use the word hieron here? Because
Right.
it sounds like he's speaking of a literal temple. But now think of these things. Everywhere else John speaks of a literal temple, especially in the Gospel of John. And by the way, John wrote the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation.
Right.
The only places he speaks of a temple is in John and Revelation. He never speaks of a temple in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John.
Okay.
So we've got a perfect little test tube here to
Yes.
measure how John uses his words. He uses them very specifically.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
So everywhere he uses the word temple in the Gospel of John, when he speaks of a literal temple in Jerusalem, he always uses hieron. Okay?
Right.
But in Revelation 11, verse 1, and everywhere else in Revelation, he never uses the word hieron. He uses the word naos. And this is especially important, watch this, because he was told to measure the outer courts. And remember that one of the definitions of hieron is literally, right out of the lexicon, the outer courts of a literal temple where the worshipers gather. Now, why did John not use hieron, speaking of the outer courts in a literal temple in Revelation 11:1? That would have been the correct word, but only if he was speaking of a literal temple. but he chose the word naos instead, which means, or one of the main, the only way John uses it is metaphorically speaking. I mean, that's huge, John. I mean, that's huge. That's huge for John, and that's huge, Mike. I hope the listeners are getting this. I know it's a little complex over a radio broadcast, but this is huge. So when John, who is the same writer of Revelation and the Gospel of John, when he comes to the book of Revelation, what Greek word does he use in Revelation 11? And by the way, every other place in the book of Revelation,
right.
He uses the word naos. So this is huge. This is a huge clue for getting a proper interpretation. Now, in Revelation 11, verse 1, it says this, quote, I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and I was told, go and measure the temple of
yes.
God and
yes.
the altar, and count the worshipers there. Now, I got to ask, that does sound like he's talking about a literal temple,
right.
Because it says it's going to be trampled on by the Gentiles, et cetera, et cetera. But you got to ask, why did John not use the word hieron? Why did he use the word that he has always used to denote something symbolic or metaphorical about the temple?
Right.
Naos. That's the word he chose. It would have been so easy for him to use the word hieron. Again, when you go to the Gospel of John, he uses the word hieron prolifically
right.
when speaking of a literal temple. But the only two times he uses naos in John, remember, were when he was speaking metaphorically. And so when we come to Revelation, John is the same writer.
Right.
He uses the word naos throughout the book of Revelation and even in Revelation 11:1. I mean, this is just huge.
Yes.
And then also consider this fact, Mike. This is really important to me. When John wrote the book of Revelation in the 90s A.D., most scholars agree, there would have been no temple in Jerusalem. The Romans had already destroyed it.
Right.
So if Revelation 11 is speaking of a rebuilt literal temple, I mean, that would be monumental. Why did John leave out this hugely important fact? Why didn't he mention that this miraculous temple that John was measuring was a rebuilt temple in the last days on the Temple Mount? I mean,
right.
You say, well, we just assume that. No, 2,000 years later, people who are trying to interpret the Scriptures, we assume that it's a rebuilt temple. But John, who's given the revelation, he doesn't say anything about it being a rebuilt temple.
Right.
Now, to me, that's huge. And,
yes.
And again, if it was a rebuilt temple, he would have done two things. Number one, he would have said, go measure the temple that was rebuilt. And number two, he would have used the word hieron for temple, since it would have been a literal temple. But he doesn't mention that it's rebuilt, and he doesn't use the word for a literal temple. He uses
right.
the word naos.
Right.
Also, remember this. He was told to count the true worshipers there.
Yeah.
Well, if it's a rebuilt temple, it would be rebuilt by the Jews. Well, there would be no true worshipers there, because the true worshipers are those who worship God through Jesus Christ the Son. I mean, that's the
yes.
whole message of the New Testament.
Yes.
And if the Jews rebuild a temple, they might rebuild a temple, Mike. They
right.
might. I mean, before our very eyes, they might rebuild a temple. But I'm just making the point, the Scriptures don't say that that's a necessity for the Antichrist to sit in a rebuilt temple. Because, you see, the Jews, if they rebuild a temple, they're rebuilding it for their Messiah. And that's not Jesus. They've rejected Jesus as Messiah.
Right.
So how can anybody in a rebuilt temple be counted as a, quote, true worshiper of God?
Right.
So that doesn't make sense either. So if there is a rebuilt literal Jewish temple in the last days, there wouldn't be any true worshipers there, because they're rejecting Jesus Christ.
Right.
But if John is talking symbolically by using the word naos of the true New Testament temple or the church or something along that line, then he would definitely use the word naos. And you say, yeah, but it says it'll be trampled on by the Gentiles. Well, Mike, I got to ask you, isn't the modern day church being trampled upon by the Gentiles?
Yes, of course. Yes, it is.
Yeah, especially out of Rome. And especially out of the mouth of the modern-day Pope, who's calling
Right.
for one-world government in the name of global warming, and especially with the apostasy of the Sodom and Gomorrah spirit that's sweeping the world and now sweeping in through the New Testament church, we have preachers and entire denominations that are accepting the entire Sodom and Gomorrah spirit. I mean, if you think of it like that, we might be watching these kinds of things happening right before our eyes right now. Well, anyway, that's
Right.
a little bit of speculation on my part, but I'm speculating from the fact that John uses the word naos instead of hieron,
Right.
and that is monumentally important. Now, another thing, the word temple is used 15 times in the book of Revelation. 15 times.
Right.
Remember, John wrote the book of Revelation. He also wrote the Gospel of John, where the word temple is used.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
In every instance in the book of Revelation, those 15 times, it is used to speak of the temple in heaven,
Right.
except for perhaps Revelation 11, of course.
Right.
But every one of them, and every time the word temple is used, John uses the word naos.
Right.
He purposely is distinguishing between hieron, the temple in Jerusalem, and naos, the temple in heaven.
Right.
And then when he gets to Revelation 11, again, he avoids the word hieron, and he uses the word naos. To me, that's a huge clue that he's not talking about a literal rebuilt temple in Jerusalem in Revelation 11. If he was, he would have used a different word, the same word that he's always used to describe the literal temple in Jerusalem. Does that make sense so far?
Well, I got a follow-up question for you here. With all of armed with all of this new knowledge, Carl, and this is going to be new to a lot of people. I'm telling you this. I have studied the Bible for 20 years, but not in the original. I have not gone to those depths, and that's why we are always so pleased to get you on the phone to to enlighten us to these things. Now, my follow-up question is: would it be reasonable then to perhaps make the prediction that this Antichrist will pose as a Christian, perhaps, standing in the temple of God? Is it possible that that could be a possibility that the Antichrist will in fact pose himself as a Christian?
Well, you know, Mike, that's a speculation on your part and my part, but it is a plausible biblical speculation based upon this word study that we're doing. And I haven't even finished this word study. I'm going to go to a few more uses in the New Testament. Then I'm going to get into the book of Daniel and look at the Hebrew words, and we find the very same pattern between metaphorical and literal. So it's astounding what I'm getting ready to tell you.
Yeah.
But based upon what I've already shared with you, yes, I mean, that's a good biblical speculation. That's one possibility, that somehow this metaphorical temple that's spoken of is connected to the last days New Testament church. We already know from the New Testament that the last days there's going to be a great apostasy sweeping through the New Testament church.
Right.
Why couldn't that apostasy result in some kind of an Antichrist figure? Maybe connected with the church in Rome, maybe connected with the Vatican, maybe connected with the apostate New Testament church in general. Maybe, and there are all kind of possibilities when we understand the original words used in the original text.
Maybe a world leader who claims every once in a while to be a Christian, but acts like anything but, perhaps. We're not naming names, but...
Yeah, that's another possibility.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
This is amazing. Now, all that I've said so far is really important, especially in light of the fact that there are some 450 verses in the Bible from Genesis to Revelation that mention the word temple. And out of those 450 verses mentioning temple, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to prove it. There's not a single verse that clearly and specifically prophesies a third temple being rebuilt. I mean, you have to infer it, but there's not a single verse that speaks literally of a third temple and calls it that, or of a rebuilt temple in the last days. 450 times the Bible speaks of the temple of God in Jerusalem, and never does it speak of a rebuilt temple or a third temple.
Right.
Now, that passage in 2 Thessalonians that I've already talked to, that's the only one where you could maybe infer that that might be the case. But again, when you consider that the specific Greek word used in that one verse alone can be used metaphorically. Now, think of a couple of other things. I want to refer to something that Jesus said in Matthew 24, and then let's talk about this 2 Thessalonians and connect it to how Paul uses the word temple, hieron and naos. Okay, this is important.
Yes.
Let's look at Matthew 24:15, where Jesus said, "So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand."
Right.
Well, people point to that, and they say, well, see there, Jesus is talking about the holy place in the temple. Well, but that is the only place in the entire Scripture where Jesus says anything about the Antichrist in a holy place. And then he says, but you get your understanding of it from the book of Daniel.
Right.
Now we're going to talk about that in a moment. But first, I want the listeners to understand where Jesus uses the word holy place, the word temple is not connected to that at all.
Right.
And I know people say, well, the holy place is in the temple. Well, maybe, but it doesn't have to be. The words used there in the Greek are simply a place that is holy.
Right.
All right? That's what the Greek literally says.
Right.
But there's no reference. Not only is there no reference to the temple, but Jesus says, if you want to understand what I'm talking about, go look at the book of Daniel. Now, we're going to do that in a moment.
Yes.
So all of this is important. But before we get to Daniel, there's one other thing that I think is another huge clue. Let's look at how Paul uses hieron and naos for the temple in the book of Corinthians, for example, and throughout every single letter he wrote in the New Testament. All right? 1 Corinthians 6:19. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You're bought with a price.
Right.
Well, that's obviously metaphorical, right?
That's right. Yes.
The word he uses for temple is naos.
Naos, okay.
Just like John. Whenever John spoke metaphorically of a temple, he used that. Now, we go to 1 Corinthians 9:13, Paul is speaking again. He says, don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? That's the same book, 1 Corinthians.
Right.
And in the same book, he now uses a different Greek word. He uses hieron.
Hieron, okay.
Because why? Because now he's speaking of the literal temple in Jerusalem. So do you see this pattern?
Yes,
Mike?
yes.
That John and Paul, every time they speak of the literal temple in Jerusalem, in all of their writings, they use the word hieron. But every time John and Paul use the word temple in the symbolic sense or the metaphorical sense, they use the word naos.
So they are establishing, Carl, they have established the pattern for us as to how we should read and study the Scriptures. This is how they have given us the template. This is how you study this. Right.
Well, now you can see why I'm so passionate about this. Again, I'm not dogmatic, but I'm passionate because I'm reading from the original languages. I see the pattern here. They've given us the template, and this was no secret. See, it's a secret to us. We have to unlock this because we don't speak Greek and Hebrew.
Right.
But John and Paul did. They understood, and their readers spoke Greek. They understood the difference. It's only a mystery to us because we speak English 2,000 years later. But when we go back and look at the words, you can see the pattern. It's clearly there. And so don't forget now. So Paul, who in 1 Corinthians, the same book, in chapter 6 and chapter 9, he uses the word symbolically, so he uses naos.
Mm-hmm.
Then he uses the word literally, and he uses the word hieron.
Right.
Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4, the only verse in the New Testament that connects the Antichrist with the temple, and he used the word naos, not hieron.
Okay. Okay.
I mean, this is just huge.
Amazing.
I don't see how we can come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 4 and pull that verse out and say, oh, well, this is a literal rebuilt temple. But wait, that's not the word Paul used.
Right.
And if you say he used it to mean a literal rebuilt temple, that would be the only time in the entire New Testament he did that.
Right.
So why would we think he would do that? That would be the only time in the entire New Testament that John or Paul did that. So why would we think that Paul would do that? Well, of course he wouldn't do that. He almost has to be speaking of a metaphorical temple in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4. I mean, to be true to the Greek and true to his use of that word. Now, let's go to the Hebrew words for temple in the book of Daniel. All right, now let's look at the Hebrew words that are used for the word temple in the book of Daniel, because Daniel's the only Old Testament book that seemingly associates the Antichrist with the temple. So this is important. I mean, we've already done this massive study of the New Testament words,
yes,
which clearly shows us that the word naos is always used when speaking of a metaphorical temple. And when we get to the only verse in the New Testament that directly connects the Antichrist with a temple, the word naos is used.
right.
So, I mean, that's pretty clear. So now let's look at the Hebrew words for temple in the book of Daniel, the only book in the Old Testament that seems to connect the Antichrist with the temple.
Uh-huh.
All right? The word is Strong's number 1965. It's like 1965.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Hebrew word pronounced, it's an Aramaic word, and it's pronounced Haykal. Haykal.
Mm-hmm.
And Heykal. Haykal.
Mm-hmm.
All right? Now, this word means a palace or a temple or a building.
Right.
Now, it's used several different ways. For example, in Daniel chapter 5, verse 2, we're going to stay right inside the book of Daniel.
Yeah.
He uses the word Haykal to talk about the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, he literally says, quote, the temple in Jerusalem. And he uses the word Haykal there.
Yeah.
All right? Now, from the Hebrew lexicon, Haykal can be used as a palace or as a temple. It can be used to speak of the temple in Jerusalem, and it can also be used to speak of a pagan temple.
Uh-huh.
For example, in the book of Ezra, chapter 5, the word is used for the Babylonian temple. Haykal is used there.
Right.
So that's what the word Haykal used. Now, the book of Daniel uses the word Haykal every single time to speak of the temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
Except for when the word temple is associated with the Antichrist.
Wow.
And then another word is used. And I'm going to get to that in just a moment.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is another huge revelation.
No,
Indeed, every time Daniel uses the word Haykal, it's used to speak of a literal temple.
Wow.
But when he gets to the temple about the Antichrist, he uses a completely different word. All right, now, there are only two places that our modern translations use the word temple in conjunction with the Antichrist in the Old Testament. Both of them are found in the book of Daniel. There are only 4 verses in Daniel that might imply that the Antichrist is in some sort of a temple. So let's look at these 4 verses.
All right.
All right? We're going to look at them in order. Daniel chapter 8, verse 11. It sets itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away, and it's talking about the Antichrist,
right.
It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Okay?
Right.
Now, you look at that and say, okay, talking about sacrifices and sanctuary.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. The word sacrifice is not in the original text. It's not there.
Okay.
And the word for sanctuary in our English translations is not Haykal.
Uh-huh.
It's Mikdash.
Mikdash.
Which doesn't necessarily speak of a literal temple building. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But you see, now he talks about the place of his sanctuary was brought low. And Daniel uses a completely different word, Mikdash. And that's Strong's number 4720. We'll talk about that in a moment, but let me keep moving forward.
Yeah.
So you can't say Daniel 8:11 is a literal rebuilt temple in Jerusalem yet. You can't say that.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, the word sacrifice is not in the original text.
Right.
And the word for sanctuary is not the word for temple. It's a completely different word.
Right.
Now, we come to Daniel 9:27. Speaking of the Antichrist, it says, he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7.
Right.
In the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering.
Right.
And on a wing of the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, that's important because that's the verse that Jesus was referring to when he said, if you want to know, what I'm talking about, this holy place, he says, go look at what Daniel says. That's the verse he's talking about.
That's right.
He will put an end to the sacrifice. And on a wing of the temple, he'll set up an abomination that causes desolation. All right, here's the problem. The words of the temple, it's not in the original text.
Wow.
It's not in the Hebrew.
Right.
It's in the English, but that was added by the translators.
Wow.
See?
Yes.
That's why in most English translations you'll find those words of the temple in a bracket, because the Hebrew doesn't have that. The Hebrew simply says, and on a wing he will set up the abomination that causes desolation. You see, the translators, Mike, assumed that it meant a wing of the temple. But the problem is, there's no reference to a temple anywhere.
Wow.
In this passage of Scripture. These are only assumptions by the translators.
You're blowing some minds here, Carl. You're blowing some minds here, brother.
All right, well, let me keep going. So the next passage in Daniel 11:31, it says of the Antichrist, his armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up an abomination that causes desolation. All right, there's the other passage Jesus had to be referring to. But this translation for temple is not Haikal. Again, it's Mikdash, Strong's 4720.
Right.
The word for Mikdash is not a literal temple, as in the one in Jerusalem.
Right.
It can be it's translated into English sometimes as temple, but it does not mean the literal temple in Jerusalem. Its true Hebrew meaning simply means a generic sanctuary or a generic holy place of any kind or any type.
Right.
So, of course, it could be used to speak of the sanctuary in the temple in Jerusalem, but here's what's important. It does not have to be used that way and is used throughout the Old Testament for other sanctuaries or holy places other than the one in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, this is huge.
Huge.
This is huge because Daniel could have easily used the word Haikal, but he didn't.
Right.
He used a completely different word. See, following the same pattern of John and Paul in the New Testament.
Right.
All right? Now, here's the fourth verse, the fourth and last verse. There are only 4 verses in the entire Old Testament that seem to connect the Antichrist with a temple. And here's the fourth one.
Mm-hmm.
Daniel 12:11. Quote, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days.
Right.
Now, in this text, the word sacrifice has been added by the translators. It's not in the original text.
Oh, man.
And no literal temple building is mentioned in that verse at all. There's nothing about a temple there. So the uses of the word mikdash, as in Daniel 8 and 11 in the Old Testament, it's used, that word mikdash is used in the Old Testament as translated as holy 1 time, holy place 2 times, holy places 1 time. Simply the word place, it's used 1 time. A sacred part of something, it's used 1 time. Sanctuary, it's used 5 times. Or sanctuaries, it's used 5 times, and the singular sanctuary is used 65 times. But never in the Old Testament is the word mikdash used to refer to the temple itself, and especially the temple in Jerusalem. Now, that is huge.
Huge.
Because every time the word temple, translated in English, is used in Daniel in relation to the Antichrist, Daniel chooses the word mikdash. Which is never used anywhere in the Old Testament to refer to the temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
So this is a striking revelation. I mean, because if Daniel meant to speak of the Antichrist in a literal rebuilt temple in Jerusalem, he'd use the word Hakon.
Right.
So, anyway, here's the bottom line to all of this.
Yes.
Here's the bottom line. Number one, there's not a single verse of Scripture anywhere that insists upon nor directly prophesies a rebuilt third temple in any direct fashion at all. I mean, Mike, as I've demonstrated, there are only a couple of verses out of hundreds of verses about the temple where one might infer that there's a rebuilt literal temple. But from the study we've just done, there are 0 verses where a strong, rock-solid, direct, literal argument is made for a rebuilt temple. It's just not there. Not in the original languages. It is not there. The second bottom line truth, there's not a single Old Testament verse that directly ties the Antichrist to a rebuilt literal temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
In its most literal statement form, it just is not there. And I just finished demonstrating that. Then the third bottom line is this. There's only one verse in the entire New Testament that seems to tie the Antichrist directly to some sort of a temple, and that's 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And as I said, in that verse, the Greek word naos is used, and every other time that Greek word is used in the New Testament, it's used to speak metaphorically. So why would we take that one verse and say, oh, well, he didn't mean metaphorically here? Why would we do that? I mean, that's a complete violation of biblical interpretation.
Right, right.
So, you know, and then you add to that there's not a single verse in the entirety of the Bible that predicts a red heifer sacrifice for some kind of a third rebuilt temple. There's not a single verse. So, but on the other hand, think of this, listeners. There are a myriad of New Testament verses that speak of the new temple, quote, you know, being the born-again believer, and being the redeemed church,
right,
and being the church in the last days. I mean, this fact is indisputable. These verses that speak of this metaphorical temple, they are dogmatic. They are direct. I mean, they are to-the-point statements of theological fact found in the New Testament, with entire treatises built around those facts.
Right.
But again, there's not a single verse in the entire Bible, much less the New Testament, that speaks of a third, rebuilt, literal temple in Jerusalem in any dogmatic, direct, or to-the-point fashion. None. There are none. And so I want to conclude this study by saying, look, it very well may be that the Jews will rebuild a third temple in hopes of encouraging the return of their Messiah, which, by the way, is not Jesus, because they utterly reject him.
Right.
They might even sacrifice a red heifer of purification.
Right.
So if you see these things happen, I mean, I wouldn't doubt it if the Jews aren't trying to make that happen.
Right.
However, if we're going to speak purely biblically, those concepts are not in the Bible.
Wow.
And that's the point of my study. And so I just want people to be aware that, listen, we're living in prophetic times.
Yes.
And so if you read these fanciful writings of people who speak of red heifer sacrifices and third temples, and there has to be a rebuilt temple for the Antichrist to be seated upon, and when, you know, I mean, that's not biblical. I mean, it's fanciful.
Right.
It's in some of the fictional literature, and it's in some of the writings of some of the modern day eschatology people. But when you do the study, as we've just done, of the Greek words, the 2 Greek words in the New Testament and the 2 Hebrew words in the Old Testament used to denote the temple or something like it, you discover quickly that there's a word for the literal temple in Jerusalem, and there's a word that's used metaphorically. And in both the Old and New Testament, the distinctions are clear.
Carl, I'm so grateful that PNN has a man of your research ability and knowledge of the original languages, and just a passion to dig deeper, to get underneath the superficial and sometimes false writings that we find in the English translations, and to get down to the deeper meanings of these things, and bring those to us, Carl Gallups. Once again, shocking the audience. You've just obliterated the beliefs of millions of people, by the way, who are going to be disappointed, but I hope they're going to be thankful that they can feel a little more enlightened to the truth here, Carl.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Mike, and I want to say one more time to the listeners, listen, when it comes to these kinds of things, I am never dogmatic about it, and I don't break fellowship with people who believe differently.
Yeah.
Now, as you can tell, I'm passionate about it because I know how to study these words, and we've done a clearly didactic study of these words.
Right.
Without trying to read anything into anything. We're following the pattern of Paul and John and Daniel, and there's a clear pattern. And so I'm passionate that we need to be very careful about insisting that a literal rebuilt third temple with a red heifer sacrifice is required for the Antichrist, because according to this word study we just did, the Bible does not clearly say that. It just does not. So, I don't want to break fellowship with anybody over this, and I'm not going to stomp my foot and say, by gosh, I'm 1,000% correct and everybody else is wrong. But I will say, go do the study for yourself. Check all the words out for yourself. Get a concordance. Get a lexicon. You'll come to the very same conclusions I've just come to.
Well, and I wouldn't dare assume the power over people's money, but if you're giving money to groups as a Christian, groups which are dogmatic about this rebuilt temple, you may want to rethink where you're putting your money. I mean, I'm not going to tell anyone what to do with their money, but you may want to rethink that. That is not a scriptural basis for that. And by the way, the groups that are promoting this third temple, they don't care what you as a Christian has to say about anything anyway, really. Honestly, do they, Carl?
Right. Well, but usually not. No. And I'm just going to say, look, I do a lot of television and radio interviews, and a lot of the hosts, I have to be very gracious. I can't go on someone's show and dress them down and correct them in front of their entire audience. But, unless they're preaching heresy, I would. But but when it comes to the matter of the temple and people get involved in that discussion, if they ask for my opinion, I'm going to give it to them clearly based upon what I've taught here. But, I'm also going to be gracious and, because there is a possibility. Like I said, I wouldn't doubt if the Jews, they've wanted a rebuilt temple ever since the second one was destroyed.
Sure.
So, I know they're planning. There's a lot of Jews in Israel that desperately want a new temple, and they very, very well may go up to the Temple Mount and build an altar even without a temple. There's some people are talking about that.
Right.
And they may sacrifice a red heifer, and they may, none of that would surprise me.
Right.
And it wouldn't surprise me if they literally start building a temple or build one. None of that would surprise me. The point that I'm making is, the Scriptures do not directly require this as a last days prophetic fulfillment, especially for the Antichrist to be seated in it.
Jesus himself said, if you tear down this temple, I will raise it up again in 3 days. That prophecy is fulfilled. There is no need for a third temple. And clearly from Carl Gallup's own study, an in-depth study of what the Scriptures really say, and we're talking about the original Scriptures. You've got the templates, you've got the pattern for Bible study with regard to these things. Carl Gallups, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure, Mike. And I also want to say to the listeners, look, this study that I just did with you is completely original to me. Now, what I mean by that is I am sure that other Bible scholars have done the very same thing and have written to this. You may find websites on this, and it would have to be almost word for word what I said, because I just took it straight from the Scriptures and straight from the lexicons.
Right.
But what I just shared with you didn't come from some other man's work. It didn't come from another website. I literally took my Greek lexicon, my Hebrew lexicon, my concordance, and went through every word, as I just did with you, in the New Testament and Old Testament, that comes anywhere near connecting the Antichrist with a temple. And I did a complete study on my own and came to the conclusions that I just showed you. So I just want the audience to know this. I didn't just go snatch this off of another website and regurgitate it.
Right.
This was the result of my lengthy, in-depth, word-by-word study. And I just shared it with the audience, and I mean, they can go check behind me now and do the same thing, but they will see that what I have said is absolutely accurate.
Well, the only other place I've seen it, Carl, is on the PNN blog, which is ppsimmons.blogspot.com, and you wrote that article. So, I mean, this is all new to me.
Well, you know, and I haven't even tried to go around and see if other scholars have seen this, but I'm sure they have. I mean, there are people who've made their entire life to study the Greek and the Hebrew. But you know, I mean, I know what the Greek lexicon says. I know what the Hebrew lexicon says, and I mean, and I just shared it with the audience, and there it is. So,
yeah.
But even more important than that, Mike, is the study we did of the patterns.
Right.
The patterns that Paul uses, and John uses, and Daniel uses. I mean, it's just striking that every time they speak of the literal temple, they use one word, but every time they speak of the Antichrist, maybe being connected to some kind of a temple, they use a completely different word that's always used metaphorically.
Right, right. Well, you've summed it up quite nicely here. I'm going to let you go because you're a busy guy. I know you've got 300 more interviews to do today, probably. You got another book coming out, right?
Yes, I do. My next book coming out is already huge, and it's not even off the press yet.
Wow.
There are ministries that have bought up many thousands of them already before they've even come off the presses. It's called Be Thou Prepared, Equipping the Church for Times of Persecution and Trouble. And it's published by WND Books, as all my books have been thus far, and it will be released September 15th of 2015.
Well, as a highly influential member of the alternative media, I already have a pre-release copy, and I highly recommend it, folks. Be Thou Prepared. Another bestseller by Carl Gallups. That's my prediction. Carl Gallups, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike. God bless you.
All right, bye-bye.